So across all of these things, one common thread that we repeatedly observe is that fundamentally the design of business is changing. And I want to clarify what exactly I mean by that. When we think of the design of business, traditionally we've always had businesses following the dominant design that I like to call the pipe or pipeline design, which is that you would source inputs into the business, you would add value on top of those inputs, and then you would push all of that out at the end of the pipe to somebody called the customer sitting over there who would just keep getting more and more output from you. And so the role of marketing over here was simply to ensure that the customer wanted more and more of what you wanted to push through the pipe. It was never about ensuring that the customer's needs were fulfilled in an end-to-end fashion. What's happening increasingly today is that this fundamental design of business is changing because of connectivity to a new design of business, which is the platform business model. What's special about the platform business model is that the design is no longer linear. The design today looks a lot like this. When we think of the platform, very often when we use the word platform, we think of the smartphone. And so if you look at the design of the smartphone as a business, if you think of what Apple and Android do, apart from the fact that they sell the handset, in the case of Apple, it sells the handset, what really drives value for the smartphone is the idea that anybody externally, any partner can come in and create value on top of the business, and a consumer can then come in and consume that value. And in doing that simple thing, what Apple has done it's just created one template phone that can be customized and extended in any direction by the user. Whereas in the past, Nokia and BlackBerry would have this whole portfolio of phones that were created in a pipe fashion by putting in a set of applications that would make a phone unique. Today, every phone is individually unique just because of this ecosystem of partners that Apple has created on top of its phone. The second example, Airbnb, is something that we talked about, where again, hosts and travelers are brought together on top of this platform and they interact with each other. YouTube, again, is an example that works in a very similar manner. And I'm using some of the examples that we are extremely well aware of, but as we abstract what works in this model, we gradually realize that a lot of this can be applied, all of this can be applied in many ways to traditional pipe businesses as well, as they move towards becoming platforms. Again, Amazon works in a very similar model where it brings in writers and readers and allows them to directly interact with each other. So if you think of this whole model, what's the template that we see repeatedly in this model is that the business no longer takes care of production. The business creates an infrastructure on which an external ecosystem of participants come on board. They create value, which then attracts consumers, and then the business essentially plays just two roles. It provides this plug-and-play infrastructure on which value can be increasingly created, and it ensures the governance of the interactions between these two sides. Because at the end of the day, the business has a brand of its own. And so it needs to ensure that it provides consumers with the minimum protection that is required to interact with third-party producers, and it needs to ensure that the third-party producers are appropriately incentivized to not work on other channels, but to work on top of this business. So this is the fundamental structure of this new emerging business model that's becoming increasingly important across industries, as we'll see very shortly. A few things that are interesting in this shift from pipes to platforms. When you think of pipes, we always think of competitive advantage on pipes on the basis of resources. The more resources you have, the better resources you have, the better you can compete. So it was always the inimitable resource that determined who won in the case of pipe competition. In the case of platforms, very often platforms do not have any resources. But the point is not whether platforms have resources or not. Uber may not own taxis, but some other company may own resources and still be a platform. What's important is that whether you own resources or not, your competitive advantage on a platform model is not on the basis of resources, it's on the basis of the ecosystem of producers and consumers you pull together that stay on over there. And so the fundamental way in which firms compete and the fundamental factors that enable firms to compete changes. The second thing that changes is that in the case of the pipe model, the goal of the pipe business is always to isolate a central process of value creation and keep making it more and more repeatable and efficient. We understand that intuitively. We do that day in and day out. But what a platform business does is in the platform business, value creation is not determined by the central process. It's determined by an external interaction between producers and consumers. And so the goal now is to ensure that this external interaction becomes repeatable and efficient. And the factors that lead to repeatability and efficiency of an external interaction are very non-intuitive, because fundamentally as a firm, as a business, we've always understood how to manage things that we control. When you are a platform business, you have to manage things that you do not directly control. You have to ensure that you're open in the right ways and closed on the assets that are most important. You have to ensure that you provide the right incentives for everyone to participate on top of your platform. And so when we move from pipes to platforms, one of the first things is that we move from a process-first model to an interaction-first model. This has a few different bearings. The first thing is that in the case of a pipe business, the role of data is just that of an enabler. What I mean by that is that data is purely informing business decisions in the case of a pipe. So you might be focused on the customer, but what really happens is you're trying to understand more and more about the customer and just serving more and more of your products and services better to the customer. Data is merely an enabler at that point. What happens with platforms is that data is not just an enabler, it's actually the driver of business. If you think of what happens on a platform like Uber, data is what decides which traveler should get which driver. So data is what drives the two things together. If you think of what happens on an Amazon today, data is what decides what kind of product should be served to you based on what you're looking for. And now that you've bought that particular product, what else would you be most likely to buy based on what others have been buying in the past? So data drives business in the case of platforms, which is not to the same extent in the case of pipes, where data has always been more of an enabler. It's always been a source of analytics rather than a business decision maker of itself. Another thing that happens when we move from pipes to platforms is that you don't just market to the consumer, you market to an entire ecosystem that might involve external producers as well. So a lot of your marketing activities may be directed to third-party partners who you would want to come on board so that they can serve your consumers and provide an end-to-end solution through your platform. And as a result of that, marketing fundamentally has always been about demand generation and fulfillment. You have this pipe, you need to generate pull at the end of this pipe so that you can push more and more things through that pipe. So as long as you can generate that pull and as long as you can fulfill that pull, your role of marketing is done. That doesn't cut it in the case of platforms. What happens with platforms is that you need to do two things in particular. You need to ensure that there are incentives rightly structured for all participants. Because if you want to get third-party partners on board, they need to be appropriately incentivized to come on board. And if you want consumers to stick onto your platform, you need to ensure that they have accretive incentives, that as they use your platform more and more, they find it more and more useful and want to stick on. Because fundamentally today, the consumer has liquid expectations, and the consumer is highly distracted. So it doesn't take the consumer much time to move from your brand to another brand. And that's why it's very important that you have incentives aligned across the ecosystem, because what happens in the case of platforms is once partners start getting disincentivized, the value for consumers decreases. Once consumers start feeling disincentivized, the value for partners decreases, and so the two sides reinforce each other both positively and negatively. And so because of that, very often technology helps you grow with a multiplier effect, but it also helps you fail with a multiplier effect, as you would have seen in the case of MySpace losing out to Facebook, for example.